is Amr Adli. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Political Science. I'll be moderating this panel. I would like very much to thank, of course, the audience for making the time to attend this talk, and definitely extend thanks to our panel participants for also dedicating the time to come and to address the question of humanitarian aid. It's like something that we were all interested in hearing about 2 months ago when the war on Gaza started, but unfortunately one that remains quite relevant, if not even more pressing than before, especially with no clear end of the war in sight. So let me introduce rather quickly our participants here. I'll start with Manuel Schwab, who's assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Egyptology. Manuel has worked on the question of humanitarian assistance. He has some previous work on Sudan, and hence, well, like I think a first-hand experience, not only academically, when it comes to the very question that we are attempting at addressing here. Then we have, of course, Jason Beckett, associate professor at the Department of Law, with a focus on public international law. His current research focuses on poverty, feminism, cultural pluralism, and the self-justification of mainstream legal analysis. Then to my right is my colleague, Dr. Nisreen Badawi, associate professor at the Department of Political Science, but she's an associate professor of public and international law at the Department of Political Science. And this is a very important piece of detail that we have here. Badawi has experience working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees on refugee law, and has offered consultancy work to several organizations on humanitarian law and Islamic law. Last but not least is Professor Ibrahim Awad, who is a professor of practice and director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the Department of Public Policy and Administration. Professor Awad has worked for the League of Arab States, the United Nations, and the International Labour Organization, holding positions of Secretary of the Commission, UNESCO, Director of ILO Sub-Regional Office of North Africa, and the Director of the ILO International Migration Program. So I'll stop here, and let's start with our panelists. So Manuel, would you like to start the panel?
Thank you so much. How's that in terms of volume? Y'all okay? Okay, I have about 10 minutes, no?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, well, welcome. I'm so glad to see a big turnout for an event like this. We need to be discussing this as much as possible. What I'm going to do today is try to frame the debate about what humanitarianism as neoliberal technology means for us a little bit. And I'm going to do it in 2 contexts. I'm going to do it in the context of humanitarianism proper, and in the context of a second kind of set of exchanges that we see. I'm an anthropologist, so forgive me, I will drift into talking about the gift a little bit. One of my panelists is laughing. Those of you who know anthropologists know that that's practically committing a cardinal sin, yeah? But I'm going to drift into the gift. The second part, after the kind of humanitarian framing, will be a bit about the circuits of violence exchange that we see that happen in the shadows of humanitarianism. Okay, so look. When we think neoliberalism, a really simple way that many of us tend to understand this tendency, this political movement, this kind of imperial process, is the stripping away of everything but kind of market logics from human life. It's the rendering of human life and people as homo economicus, as these units of consumption, these units that are imbued with certain rights, okay, great, that have certain responsibilities, but that essentially can best be taken care of in the modes in which the market manages to distribute needs, wants, etc. And so in a certain sense, it's an odd fit to talk about humanitarianism as a neoliberal technology. Of course it is. And I could tell you volumes about how we see this kind of detail work on the ground in places like Sudan, Haiti, across the globe. But I'm going to focus here, so that we stay on our topic, on a way that I think we can get into understanding this. About 20 years ago, just before the second Intifada launched off, in a speech to the Knesset, Ariel Sharon, who back then was Prime Minister of Israel, in a speech where he for the first time mentioned something that we later come to know as disengagement, that the kind of liberal media at the time was talking about as Palestinian independence, but of course there's much more to independence than disengagement. When he for the first time proposed to the Knesset disengagement, can y'all please, if the phones ring, that's cool, but then shut them up. Thank you. Just for, you know, for the rest of the panelists too. He framed the proposal to a Knesset that was not necessarily expecting to hear Ariel Sharon, of all people, say something about disengagement, with the reminder of the millions of Palestinians who lived under occupation, who relied for their everyday livelihood and upkeep on humanitarian agencies at the international level, and said, do you really want to deal with them? The proposal he was making is that if humanitarian law gets tired, if humanitarian assistance gets tired, if humanitarian aid stops entering into the occupied territories, these become, under occupation law, the responsibility of the occupying state. And his interest in disengagement, explicitly, was to avoid that form of responsibility. This, I want to propose, tells us everything we need to know about how humanitarianism and humanitarian aid operate as a neoliberal technology, yeah? And here's how I would unpack it. At the moment when we are facing not a political community, not a population of socially embedded people that all people are, the Palestinians ought to be no exception, although often when we look at the way they are presented in the world, they are the ultimate exception to this. If we think of people as embedded in social worlds that are absolutely crucial for sustaining their lives, and we render them as neoliberal subjects who are simply consuming and in need, whose needs can best be met by the market, yeah? But who also have rights, that has a few implications. The rights part should be good news. It means we can't, well, at least theoretically, just bomb them from the air. We can't, well, at least theoretically, simply occupy them with levels of brutality that make other forms of civilian targeting violence that we have seen in the last years look minuscule, although I do want to remind us about Sudan, which is often forgotten in this case. It ought theoretically to make that kind of direct violence more difficult. We see that it hasn't. But in the moments when we have seen a certain modicum of restraint placed on states as a result of the humanitarian paradigm, what we have often seen is that the technologies of siege and sanction are put at the forefront of the ways in which people are dominated. They have rights not to be bombed. But if the market is the thing that is supposed to take care of their fundamental rights, what often gets lost is that economic violence, which includes the destruction, disabling, or other form of intervention into their infrastructures of life support. Now, obviously, right now we're seeing bombing of these infrastructures from the air. But we need to not forget that during all the decades of occupation that we have behind us, infrastructure has been a central target of the occupational state. A central target that has systematically made life unlivable in Gaza, and has done so while maintaining the fiction that we are dealing with a humanitarian form of management. Why? Because we're not attacking bodies. Yeah? Zoom forward to our present moment. In our present moment, we then see that we are no longer facing a brutal, atrocity-based onslaught on civilians that is engineered to cleanse them out of areas where they're not meant to stay, that is engineered to make life unlivable not just now, but for generations in perpetuity, what we see, as the comment notes for this panel put out, is essentially a big humanitarian crisis. A bit, as the organizers mentioned, like an earthquake or a flood. Force majeure, no agency. It's a natural disaster. And within this paradigm, the humanitarian pause that takes the place of ceasefire, that takes the place of the respect for the rights of civilians, no matter who and what they are, that takes the place of all of the political forms of protection that we ought to be extending to people globally under every condition and by any means necessary. The humanitarian pause comes in and says, well, this will allow aid to enter the vacuum. The very conditions, Yagama, of the life of Palestinians has been rewritten as a gift being given by an occupying force, a gift being given by an international empire for which Palestinians ought to feel grateful. This is a shameful, shameful reframing of the responsibilities of protection and the way that violence works. So that much for the way that the humanitarian can be seen as neoliberal. There's another version of the gift that we see working in the humanitarian logics of occupation that I think we often forget. And excuse me, I'm going to just barrage you with some details that I invite you please to look up online. Because what we essentially have in these forms of humanitarianism as an international imperial form is another form of gift exchange. And it is the mutual reciprocity. The gifts given between occupying powers, between empires, between those who have tried to pacify their own restive populations, a mutual exchange of weapons, funding, legal logics, and tactics of counterinsurgency. And I'm going to talk for the next, I have, what, about 4 minutes, 5 minutes? I'm going to talk for those minutes. I might go a minute or two about the way this looks between Israel, Ferguson, New York, Los Angeles, all the places in which Black Lives Matter protesters have been rising up against militarized occupations from which the weapons have been recycled out of theaters of occupation, and Iraq. We have, in 2011, a national counterterrorism seminar in Israel in which names like Timothy Fitch, the St. Louis police chief, who presided over the occupation of Ferguson after the killing of Michael Brown, police chiefs from New York, from LA, from all these places. 9,000 different police officers in the US were trained in 2011 and the subsequent years in Israel under a program known as the National Counterterrorism Seminar. This is a form of expertise that teaches people how to make civilian populations in dense urban publics manageable. Yeah? That didn't just get recycled back into the US. This form of expertise was also exported in those years to Iraq, where, as Eyal Weizman, an Israeli architect and geographer who has done enormous amounts to identify the violence of the occupation, reminds us, this also led to what he calls the Palestinianization of Iraq. The strategies of keeping Iraq pacified under the auspices and forms that were learned in Gaza and the West Bank as laboratories for civilian pacification. Yeah? Now, when this kind of expertise goes out to Iraq, we have a massive investment by the US of capital into military technologies that are sent out barra to and elsewhere to pacify others. If when this war ends, we leave our weapons out there, it's a big waste of resources, right? And so under two programs, I'll just name them, two programs named Program 1208 and 1033, 1990 and 1997, provisions were made that the US government could buy these weapons back from the military and transfer them directly to civilian law enforcement agencies who made special requests also on taxpayer payments. The same weapons, my friends, that were tested in Palestine, that were used in Afghanistan and Iraq to run the counterinsurgencies of Fallujah, to oppress civilian populations in each of these places, returned back and are seen, if you look at the images, in the hands of domestic US police forces policing their own captive and restive populations of black communities in under-resourced neighborhoods. Yeah? This is a massive gifting exchange of technologies of destruction, and it is run by the logic of the market. So on the one hand, human lives become a gift that we are giving back. And on the other hand, we see the imperial forces that we must address trading gifts of destruction with one another that render each of these populations in solidarity and in unity under one auspice alone. They are a problem for white supremacist states. They are a problem for occupational states. And the gift circle continues. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll talk in the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Manuel. So, Jason?
Hi. Not really sure how to follow this. It was like an epic poem, and now I've got fragmentary notes, and this feels unfair. So I want to start, I think, with the very obvious. And the very obvious is that neoliberalism is a political ideology masquerading as an economic theory. It has been presented for the last 40 plus years as a brute fact of nature, something beyond politics and economic science. It is none of these things. Neoliberalism is a technology of wealth concentration. It functions to make the rich richer by making the poor poorer. And it does that, importantly, both within countries and between countries. Neoliberalism produces inequality. Inequality produces social unrest, and social unrest produces increasingly authoritarian policing. Neoliberalism has only ever worked, to the extent that it has ever worked, under military dictatorships. International law is a colonial project. It's a civilizing project. It has been for 470 years. Since at least the 1980s, international law has slowly become a specifically neoliberal civilizing project. So for about 2 centuries, international law functioned to create the conditions for capitalism and capital accumulation to expand around the world. In the 1970s, particularly in the United States of America, capitalist economics became obsessed with neoliberalism. And neoliberalism moved from being a fringe preoccupation of lunatics to being the hegemonic economic model in less than 10 years. And that was very unfortunate timing. In 1983, as a result of a number of shocks over the preceding decade, there was what became known as a third world debt crisis. The developing states had debts that they believed they could not repay. After failing to renegotiate these debts, the third world states threatened simply to default on their debt. The bankers, the creditors, approached the United States administration and said, please persuade them not to default on their loans. The United States did persuade these countries, against their own better interests, not to default on their loans. But the only way they could avoid default was by refinancing with the International Monetary Fund. And in 1983, the International Monetary Fund imposed its first set of neoliberal conditionalities in a loan to Turkey. Every IMF loan since has come with increasingly stringent neoliberal conditionalities. We have had almost exactly 40 years of neoliberal intervention by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the World Trade Organization, and supervised by the system of international investment arbitration. In that period of time, a grand total of 0 states have developed, or progressed, or improved under IMF tutelage. In other words, neoliberalism has a precise and perfect 100% record of failure as a development model. And it continues to be forcefully imposed by international institutions through international law onto the underdeveloped states of the world. As a result of this neoliberal order, governed by international law, governed by the dictates of humanity, governed by what Ruti Teitel calls humanity's law, 15% of the global population, what we call the developed states, living in the world's largest gated community, devour 85% of the planet's annual consumption. Vice versa, 85% of the global population, excluded from the gated settler community of the global north, survives on 15% of global consumption. Neoliberalism is a cancer that has deeply infected the international legal project. Even wars are a neoliberal exercise, as Manuel said, in essentially money laundering. So the US says, we're going to give $14 billion to Israel. But what the US actually does is spend $14 billion on private weapons manufacturers to produce stuff to send to Israel. So you get 2 separate movements going on. You get the privatization of public wealth in the United States, and you get the conditions continuing for genocide in Gaza. I thought about talking about development. I thought about talking about third world sovereignty, but I'm just going to close with a couple of observations. One, what is happening in Gaza right now is genocide. There's nothing arguable about that. 2, and I hate to be alarming, but as soon as next week, the number of Gazans dead by disease will begin to outstrip the number of Gazans dead by military violence. And that genocide in our current neoliberal order takes place in a wider economic genocide, a global economic genocide. Israel is a settler colonial state. But this thing that we call the West or the North or the developed states is also a settler colonial state. That settler colonial state uses legal and economic rather than physical violence. But under its rule, the richest state in the world per capita earns 491 times more than the poorest state in the world per capita. At the height of colonialism, it was 30 to 1. So after 60 years of decolonization and neoliberal restructuring, things are infinitely worse than they were. And when I say infinitely, 16,000 people have been killed in Gaza. 16,000 people, let me correct, have been recorded dead in Gaza. The actual death toll is likely to be at least double that. And that's in only 2 months. And that is horrific. But the global economic order kills 50,000 people every single day. So I've said this before, and I'll end on it again. Gaza is a small but dramatic genocide unfolding within a much wider, much less dramatic genocide. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Okay. I think that both presentations have framed very well the ongoing crisis, the humanitarian question that is raised about them, and the title of the talk about neoliberalism, because the analytical link might not have been very clear at the beginning. So thanks a lot for both interventions. So now off to Nisreen. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Amr. So I'm not as eloquent and I'm not good as offering a grand narrative as my two colleagues are, but what I'm going to try and do today is to give a sense of how the legal regime creates the space for the materialization of the situation that we are witnessing now, the situation that has been brilliantly described by both Manuel and Jason. So I'm going to take it a little bit more to the ground and to the details of how international law actually works in a manner that creates the space for Israel to be absolved of its responsibilities towards the population in Gaza. And I'll start out by articulating occupation law. Occupation law is a legal regime that is devised to establish obligations on the occupier once it occupies a territory. And this is part of the regime of international humanitarian law. I just, as a footnote, I want to apologize to the students who attended the class, and the topic of our class today was that, so I apologize for the repetition. But so occupation law is a subset of international humanitarian law, and international humanitarian law in general claims to be agnostic to the legitimacy of the conflict and agnostic to the legitimacy of why you are engaged in conflict. It claims to apply certain rules to the warring parties, regardless of whether or not they are legitimately there. And when it comes to occupation, it claims to, again, suspend or it has a very ambiguous position on the legality of an occupation. Whether or not an occupation is legal is not a question that international humanitarian law claims to be concerned with, and it's much more concerned with how you conduct yourself as an occupying power. Now, that has developed over time from the Fourth Hague Convention at the dawn of the 20th century to the Fourth Geneva Convention, and then in 1949, and then the additional protocols in 1977. And the claim that we are given in the narrative of international humanitarian law is that international humanitarian law is moving more and more towards protection of the people, away from being centered on and fixated on protecting the territory for the previous sovereign and keeping it intact for the previous sovereign, and that we're shifting towards protecting of the populations by establishing obligations on the occupying power to provide services and to protect the population under its control. However, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is often relied to as the primary legal tool for establishing the rules and the obligations of the occupying power in the Palestinian territories, especially by the International Court of Justice, since Israel is not a party to Additional Protocol 1, has a very significant caveat within it with regards to the obligations of the occupying power in terms of provision of humanitarian services, which is Article 6 of the Convention, which establishes that the Convention applies in a limited fashion after 1 year from the general close of military occupations in a situation of occupation, and it limits the duties that an occupying power is expected to uphold after 1 year from the general close of military operations. And the limited nature of those obligations seem to correspond to a great extent with the idea of negative rights and positive rights, whereby after 1 year from the general close of military operations, absurdly enough, you are expected to provide less. And you are expected to simply refrain from discrimination, refrain from encroaching upon rights, but without provision of services. Now that becomes even more absurd in the context of situations of prolonged occupations and in the context of the occupied Palestinian territories, because you're dealing with decades of occupation where one is left with the very legitimate question of, if the occupier is not expected to do it, who is? Who provides education services? Who provides medical services? To simply say that you're expected to refrain from preventing humanitarian access might be applicable in a 6-month conflict, or to say that we're going to suspend the obligation to provide education might be applicable for 6 months, but not for 70 years. However, this is the direction that international humanitarian law takes. Now, that direction is made even more absurd by the interpretation of the International Court of Justice of Article 6 in its advisory opinion on the separation wall, where it defines the general close of military operations as the general close of military operations leading to the occupation, an interpretation that is not provided for by the language of the Convention, that is argued by many to have been a novel interpretation of Article 6 in the Geneva Convention, but it allows the court to basically take the position that despite the fact that you see a constant level of violence, if you look at it from a distance, in the Palestinian context, despite the fact that Israel will engage in military operations in Gaza every 2 years or so, with varying degrees of intensity, that doesn't matter. What matters is the military operations that led to the occupation in 1967, allowing for a limited application of the Convention and for the denial of obligations, positive obligations on the occupying power. Now that is the law from the international side. Now that law from the international side is utilized by an occupying power that is making the realization that many colonial states had made a long time ago, which is that it's actually easier and better for you to control all the exits, to control all the strings without actually carrying the obligations that you are expected to carry when you are responsible for a population. Now that is mirrored by Israel's opting for the Oslo Accords first, transferring many obligations to the Palestinian Authority, and then afterwards, that didn't seem to be enough, the disengagement plan, which provided the space for Israel to make a claim that might not be convincing for many international actors and many legal experts, that Israel no longer occupies Gaza. Even though it controls its borders, even though it controls the flow of humanitarian goods, it's not an occupying power, hence to limit the obligations even further than the limitation that is offered by the International Court of Justice in its interpretation of the application of Article 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Thereby, we see how international humanitarian law and the tools that are created within it And its understanding of occupation creates the space for Israel to renege on its responsibility towards the Palestinian peoples with legal claims. Now, we might debate whether those legal claims are legitimate or not. And there is basis to argue that they're not legitimate. There is basis to argue that this is an illegal interpretation of the law. But the point is that the fluidity of the law creates the space for an argument, creates the space for a legal argument that is utilized then to legitimize your actions. Now, add to that, and I want to just come back now to questions of whether or not there are other branches of international law that might offer us assistance other than international humanitarian law in this situation. I mean, at the end of the day, even the limited interpretation of the Fourth Geneva Convention requires guarantee of humanitarian access. It might not require provision, but it requires guarantee of humanitarian access. But that requirement is limited by the other principles within international humanitarian law that allow the state to measure whether or not it provides services, whether or not it targets a particular target on the basis of proportionality, on the basis of to what extent the military advantage outweighs civilian loss, in order for it to make an argument that here, yes, they might have an obligation to provide humanitarian access, but the military advantage outweighs civilian loss with all the irrationality of that equation. But now one might say that we can find recourse on the law on the use of force and not necessarily international humanitarian law. And that brings me to the question that is brought by brought to the panel today, which is the idea of the novelty of a humanitarian pause or novelty of a ceasefire. International law requires neither. International law simply requires that if you're resorting to the use of force legitimately, and that is potentially a question mark here as well, based on the interpretation of the International Court of Justice, but if you are using force legally, that use of force must be only resorted to, that self-defense needs to be necessary. So here, in that case, one might legitimately ask the question whether or not it is still necessary for Israel to continue to use force. Has the threat been eliminated or not? And a very plausible argument can be made that it has been eliminated, perhaps from day one. One can actually make the argument that the attack could not have been replicated in the first place, that there's no threat, or there's no real and significant and clear threat of the replication of that attack. But again, the fluidity of international law allows for the claim that no, as a matter of fact, as long as Hamas is there, then there is a continued necessity to eliminate Hamas, hence no obligation to either implement a ceasefire or even a humanitarian pause. So I want to conclude that by pointing out that international law has been complicit in the creation, I mean, as argued by Jason and Manuel, has been complicit in the occupation, in the legitimation of, in devising legal techniques and legal tools that legitimize the discretion of the state, because it's at the end of the day a very state-centric system, the discretion of the state when it comes to when and how to use force, and finally, how it accrues or how it accepts responsibilities as an occupying power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasreen. Okay, a lot of input. Okay, so now we move to Professor Ibrahim Awad, who is here as a discussant. I should have clarified this at the beginning. I should have also clarified the context in which we are trying to tackle the question of humanitarian aid amid the ongoing war from the angle of neoliberal technologies of domination and control. This, of course, was an idea that our colleague Nadine Aboud came up with within the context of a project that we are running under the GAP School, which is based on a Ford grant tackling the question of pathways from neoliberalism with a focus on MENA. Of course, we did not have the situation of Gaza, which is something that is extremely complicated and has so many variables, has a very long history of exceptionalism on many cases, given the idea that, of course, the incident of occupation was created at the very moment when a system based on the universalization of sovereign national or territorial states was being created following the end of World War II. Professor Awad, as a discussant, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amr, and thank you very much to Drs. Nisreen, Jason, and Manuel. I find myself at a loss what to discuss, what to comment on. But I think it was very useful to place the current violence in Gaza in its historical context. And I think this was done by all three panelists, starting with Dr. Manuel. And I think it's very good that he mentioned what Ariel Sharon said before the withdrawal from Gaza. Because in Sharon's perspective and in Israel's perspective, since the withdrawal from Gaza, you had a sort of a neoliberal project settling the occupied West Bank and delegating the occupation and the security of the Israeli order in the West Bank to Israeli. It's an odd time.
Okay. Okay. So just like to let everybody know, Manuel was just telling me that she's okay. She's perfectly fine. Yes. Okay. So yeah, we are concluding the event. So, Professor, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amr. I was saying that the Israeli perspective and its implementation of the Oslo agreements of 1993 was to encourage the settlement of the West Bank, to leave it to the settlers to settle this West Bank, and to keep the peace and the order that Israel wants in the West Bank. So it is a sort of outsourcing of security and outsourcing of keeping order to the settlers. This is very much a technique of neoliberalism, reducing the role of the state. But this is also a very Israeli version of neoliberalism, because you do not have one version of neoliberalism, like you do not have one version of socialism or of communism. So, and the version in the West Bank is settlers supported and abetted by the state. So, in fact, the state does not withdraw completely in neoliberalism, neither in Israel nor in any other country. In fact, the state intervenes differently in the governance, not only of the economy, as Jason said. It's not a matter, an economic issue. It is really a political project. I think that I was very glad that Dr. Manuel referred to the concept of humanitarian pause. I do not think that any such concept exists in international law. I don't even think that truce, ceasefire are defined in international law. But pause has an obscene dimension to it, because I think, I don't know, but probably most of those here are interested in social science, and maybe certainly some of exact sciences are here. But in social science and in humanities, we only have words, and words are important. Meanings are important. And if you open any dictionary and look up what pause means, one of the meanings is rest, raha. So in fact, this is a humanitarian raha. Raha to whom we don't know, frankly, whether it's rest for the Palestinians or whether it's rest for the Israelis, because we remember that the first truce in 1948, Israel used their first truce in 1948 to rearm and to expand much beyond the territory that was allotted to it by the resolution 181 of the UNGA. So rest first is, I think, is obscene, and then rest to whom and what use make of it. I think that I very much liked the history of neoliberalism as reviewed for us in a few minutes by Jason. But I will not delve in that to a great extent. I will just mention what he said about the 14 billion US dollars that the US will give in support to Israel. Neoliberalism coincided with the ascendance of the United States to the top as only superpower. There is, chronologically, a parallel. Neoliberalism starts in 1979, 80, 81, and then this is when the United States gets out of the fixed exchange rate system, when it stops the convertibility of the dollar alone, without any consultation with anyone. And then, of course, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the United States alone on top of the international. And this is when the United States also intervenes alone in the Middle East and in dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is reduced now to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But at the same time, these $14 billion are, according to Jason, and I agree with him in that, are given to the weapons industry in order to manufacture weapons to give to Israel, which reinforces the power of the industrial military complex in the United States, and which exercises influence over how decisions are made and how policies are made. So in fact, this is a reinforcement of the neoliberal order within the United States itself. So this is the linkage between neoliberalism and the policies that, in fact, neoliberalism produces policies, but policies also reinforce neoliberalism, even not directly, if not directly related to the Gaza conflict. Dr. Nisreen talked about the obligations of the occupying powers. And she mentioned who provides services, who provides education, who provides health services, who provides housing. In the order supposedly constructed after the Oslo Agreement, the Palestinian Authority is responsible for. So the occupying power, in fact, is no longer is exempted from providing these services. But at the same time, the Palestinian Authority is deprived of the resources that should accrue to it under the Paris Agreement, for instance. So the Palestinian Authority is left without the resources necessary to provide the services. Who provide the services in this case? Other actors, which in fact eats at any legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. In addition, of course, to the Palestinian Authority cooperating with the Israeli state. But the inability of the state in neoliberalized countries, and not only the Palestinian, in fact, results in eating at the basis, at the foundations of the state and at the legitimacy of the state, and in fact provide more and more credibility to those providing the services, including to those providing security services. And then they complain. They complain that others are providing the services and others provide even the security services. Not only, if you talk about Gaza in particular, who was providing the education and health services in Gaza? 80% of Gaza inhabitants are refugees. Who is providing these services to them? UNRWA. And UNRWA is decried, continuously decried, as preserving the nationalist and developing the nationalist discourse and the patriotic discourse. And the result was depriving UNRWA of resources. Not only did President Trump stop all financing, but others also reduced the resources, even if some others, yeah. So there is a question also of delegitimizing international solutions, organizations, international arrangements, let's put it this way, from providing these services. It is, I think, no coincidence that you have in no other conflict since the UN was established, over 100 UN staff members were killed in a conflict in a matter of a few weeks. Is this a coincidence? In fact, there is no effort at all to preserve, neither journalists nor UN personnel. And it's not, let's say, maybe they're not talking, but they're not taken into account. In fact, if they perish, much better. So this is also a way of depriving the Palestinian people in Gaza of the services that they deserve. What is the final purpose? What is the final purpose? Yesterday I was interviewed by a foreign TV. What is the purpose? I said that there may be several hypotheses. One of them to finish Hamas completely, which is extremely difficult, and you do not have. How will you measure whether Hamas has been destroyed completely? You don't have a measure. What are the indicators for Hamas to be destroyed completely? The second hypothesis is that Israel, this has been said recently, Israel has, again, one of the, and reoccupy, and there is talk about the huge gas resources of the coast of Gaza, maybe Israel. And the third, of course, is to push the Gaza inhabitants towards Egypt. And this, of course, will be, I think the discussion will go beyond neoliberalism, which will be, in fact, a clear and flagrant violation of the agreement that binds Egypt to Israel since 1979. And I think that this needs to be very seriously taken into account. So yes, neoliberalism, the state and the violence and the deprivation of any humanitarian concern, because international humanitarian law, and I speak in presence of the specialists. Why is it called humanitarian law? I think it's because it is that branch of international law which deals with human beings as a species. So we can be violent to each other, but there is a limit because we all belong to the same species at the end. So if you really ignore even the very basics of humanity, so this is not a violation of international law, it's a violation of humanity itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Awad. Thanks a lot for all the panelists. I'm not sure, do you have time for a quick round of questions from the audience? Okay. I know that it's already 2 o'clock. For those of you, of course, who have classes, please go to your classes. But those who have time, so the floor is open for comments or questions. Yes, please, the hand at the very, very back. I can only see the hand. I cannot see the face. Yes.
Hello.
Maybe you can introduce yourself and go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Lucila. I'm a graduate student from...
Why don't you stand up? And if you just can wait until the
course.
exodus is, the exodus of students, yes, is done.
Those leaving, thanks for coming.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Please go ahead.
My name is Lucila. I'm a graduate student from Columbia University, and I'm currently applying for a PhD in international law at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And I have a question for Professor Balawi. My question is, in an ideal scenario in which self-defense could not be invoked, and given the substantive financial support that the US is providing to Israel, would it be possible to hold the US accountable through the issue of attribution?
Thank you. This is a rather complex question. Potentially, theoretically, what we're talking about are potential violations of erga omnes obligations under international law, violations of obligations that are owed to the international community as a whole, and violation of norms of international law that are so paramount that the expectation is that they're not to be deviated from. And those obligations carry with them unique attributes of state responsibility, where the expectation is that every member of the international community is expected not to offer aid or assistance to such violations and to cooperate within the realm of the Charter to bring those violations to an end. And this is the language that has been precisely been used by the International Court of Justice on the separation wall advisory opinion with regards to the legality of the separation wall. So theoretically, you might hold states, the United States and other states, liable or responsible, to use the language of international law, for offering aid or assistance to Israel. However, the benchmark for aid and assistance in the doctrine on state responsibility is incredibly high, and it requires that the state has full knowledge of the legality of the act, has full knowledge that its contribution is going towards an illegal act, and that it actually does so. Of course, as outsiders, we might say that there's plausible basis to argue that those conditions are met. But also, when we get into the language of intent, and particularly intent of states, it becomes very murky. And you can make an argument that that the United States is assisting Israel with the objective of acting legally within the framework of self-defense, rather than violating the laws of war. It helps that Israel makes a claim that it's acting in self-defense, but it also helps more that the United States throws those punchlines every now and then about expecting restraint from Israel. So when they say that, they're asserting that we are not assisting the excessive use of force and we're requiring constraint. Our assistance is only going towards use of force that is legitimate and legal. So theoretically, yes, but practically speaking, with a very high benchmark for aid and assistance that is deliberately designed by states to get them out of legal liability, it's difficult.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to add, yes, obviously you can make a legal argument against what the Americans are doing. It's complicity and genocide. But the fundamental point is there's nowhere to take that argument. There's no court to take it to, there's no tribunal, there's no institution with the capacity to apply international law. So it's entirely the wrong paradigm to think about it. We have to attack the US strategically, morally, politically, but I'm sorry, because I know you want to do a PhD, but give up on the idea that international law can help. It can't.
I wasn't going to focus necessarily on this topic for my application, but thank you.
Don't. Other questions, other comments? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a first-term grad student in the Migration and Refugee Studies program. My question is about these areas that are manufactured by neoliberal states of limited statehood, like Palestine and like others. When NGOs that are local and international assume parastatal functions in these places, how do you see their role as propping up or cleaning up for the neoliberal order?
Is this like
For the whole panel.
So whoever wishes to jump in, yes, please.
I mean, it's an excellent, it's a broad question that has many, many answers. It's an excellent question. Yes, on the one hand, clearly the statement that I started with by Ariel Sharon recognizes this parastatal function and that, you know, there's a certain kind of almost negative symbiosis between these two forms. Now, I get a little bit cagey when we start to believe that, you know, people working for UNRWA, for instance, would be a good example, or in general for these organizations, are in some way sort of deliberately in collusion. I don't think that's quite the paradigm I would use. I do think that we have precisely that question, and I think Nisreen put it really well when she said there is a way in which controlling the exits is very important, and then just allowing what happens inside can be a very good strategy for states. This is, I think, part of what you're referring to. And within that strategy, the humanitarian is a critical part. You control the exits and you allow them to, as you know, I was trying to put it, fill a gap that is produced and that is reproduced and that's maintained quite deliberately. I do have a bit of optimism sometimes when I look at Sudan before the current conflagration of the last 7 and some months. I do have some optimism that you see local, that you see the occupied, if we're using that paradigm, or you see those who kind of need to live in those humanitarian enclaves, developing quite quickly, very clever and brilliant strategies of diverting, absconding, speaking the language for different strategic purposes. And I think that that's a good place to focus if there's optimism to be had. There's a good place to focus on strengthening and trying to draw attention to those strategies and, well, frankly, getting people who are policymakers in these international NGOs to get out of the way and allow them to do it. But I don't know if that speaks to it.
Well, let me add, I'm in agreement with Manuel. I think that neoliberalism has reduced the volume of the state and the spectrum where it intervenes and left it open. So you have the market, but you have civil society as well. And civil society organizations can be very useful. They can be also very nocive, but they can be very, very useful. And they provide services. They develop narratives. Who is now carrying the Palestinian cause? Arab states? No. Who is carrying the Palestinian cause? Yes. Civil society, students like you in European, US universities, Canadian universities, and international and national NGOs. The Palestinian civil society has developed, I remember 30 years ago, I was giving a course at the International Training Center of an international organization, and a Palestinian participant, very clever, said he had come to 1 or 2 courses, and he said, this might be the last course because after 1993 and the Palestinian Authority, maybe the state will keep civil society from flourishing. I will not be able to come back. Of course, Palestinian Authority has developed in some sectors, in other sectors it has not developed at all. So I think, like Manuel, I think that there is room. It's not It's not completely negative, that not at all. It could be positive that civil society organizations occupy some of the terrain. Don't forget that we're talking about neoliberalism, but we also are, I think, all of us here think that we need to think dialectically. It's dialectical. So neoliberalism produces its antithesis. And this is what opens the door for us to look forward. Neoliberalism, you know, it's not the end of the world. The world will continue, and other things will emerge. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Oh, sorry. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was going to answer the last question before we take the next one. And it's kind of the same point as I made earlier. Don't get caught up with the exceptionalism of Palestine. The only thing that's exceptional about Palestine is the visibility. Now, you're right, Palestine is not a state. But it's important to recognize that no formerly colonized country has sovereignty. And no formerly colonized country has ever been allowed sovereignty. And neoliberalism is a project designed to limit, if not eliminate, state sovereignty. But more importantly, so is humanitarianism. Human rights is a project to delimit state sovereignty. And it's important to acknowledge that human rights and neoliberalism have worked very closely together to create this ridiculous narrative that underdeveloped states are underdeveloped because they don't respect human rights, rather than being underdeveloped because they used to be colonized and they're now being plundered by their former colonial masters. So what I want to emphasize is that international law is full of binaries, and the binary between developed and undeveloped states, the binary between civilized and uncivilized states, rights-bearing and non-rights-bearing states, is central to the way that international law operates. Palestine is only an extreme example of that operating. And again, and I'll leave it with this, in the 1970s, the third world states got together to create something called the New International Economic Order, which was designed to produce substantive economic sovereignty in the underdeveloped world. And through a joint campaign of essentially the G7 nations and the human rights community, especially Médecins Sans Frontières, that whole campaign was systematically sabotaged, delegitimated, discredited, and destroyed. And I hate to be the really cynical old person in the room, but let's be honest, if we're talking about humanitarian and neoliberal technologies, the humanitarian industry doesn't want to get rid of atrocities. The humanitarian industry has nothing to do if we get rid of atrocities, which is why they do bullshit like report on atrocities without ever explaining why they're happening. Because it's absolutely in their interest that atrocities keep happening. It's absolutely in their interest that third world states are denied sovereignty. It's absolutely in their interest that this Western European humanitarian project is entitled to intervene anywhere it wants in the world. So again, mourn for Gaza, fight for Gaza, but don't see it as exceptional.
Please.
Thank you to all the panelists first, because this was very insightful and each one of you talked for a different angle. So I want to get back to the point of neoliberalism. We talked a lot about the ways in which it restricts and its disadvantages, but I want to imagine that I'm talking with someone who's a proponent of neoliberalism, and what would you reply to their top arguments? Like for people who are proponents of neoliberalism, they would reply to the points that you guys have mentioned in probably ways that you expect. So what would you, if you were in a conversation with these, like their top bullet points, what they would say, what would you reply to their criticism of what they say, basically.
May I abuse my power as a moderator? Yes. I think that neoliberalism might have started, especially in the small academic circles during in the direct years dealing to World War II and afterwards, like the schools of like ordoliberalism, neoliberalism, etc. Like it was some form of a self-proclaimed adherence of liberalism, providing a new interpretation to it, with very strong and vehement resistance to what they saw as a bestial state that was going to take over the economy, society, etc. However, what has happened in the past 20 years at least is that neoliberalism has become appropriated completely by the critics of the institutions, the structures, the relations, the notions, the norms that are perceived or as interpreted as neoliberalism, to the extent that you won't find any neoliberals, by the way. They don't exist anymore as self-proclaimed neoliberals. And neoliberalism is not even acknowledged as like a power, as an ideology, as a power project, as whatever, because they deal with it as part of the natural. Like this is how things are. So don't tell me that like the market is natural. This is how things should be. This is how things are. So there is this very strong normative and prescriptive element in it, to the extent that you can come across very strong like textbook neoliberals, by the ones that you find in the encyclopedia, like Homo neoliberalis, and yet they would not claim to be neoliberals. So that's extremely interesting about the history of the notion, or the concept itself, how it became completely appropriated by the critics of neoliberalism as we speak nowadays.
Can I just add that wholeheartedly agree, and insofar as neoliberals, now that it's hegemonic and natural, are no longer neoliberals, they're just known as economists. The way that I would reply to them is every economic crisis that have happened since 1971 in a massive cyclone circulating the globe, in any country that has been subjected to neoliberal reform by force, or the countries who have chosen by their own electoral worlds. Nobody really chooses neoliberal reforms, yeah, but these cyclones, that's all they need to see. Explain how this is a successful economic project, and then we'll talk.
Yeah, I want to say the same thing. Just don't argue with religious fanatics. You can win.
You are the original speakers.
So one other thing I want to add is also don't assume a monolithic constituency that you're talking to. There are neoliberals who might claim that they're dismayed by the casualties that you're witnessing in Palestine, who might claim that this is just an error in terms of how the Israeli state is approaching its policies, how it's waging war, how it's conducting itself. You might find ones who justify it. So in your responses, I think you also need to be strategic in the sense of that you understand the constituency that you're talking to, where it comes from, its interests, its ideological underpinnings, its proposed solutions, in order for you to prepare a strategic response. So it's not a question of how you define ideology here. I think what you're looking for is the strategic engagement with people who espouse those ideologies. And I would say just don't assume that you're dealing with a monolithic front here.
I think that, some neoliberals are critical of neoliberalism because they are critical of some segments of neoliberalism. So I think this is very important what Dr. Nasreen said. But you can mention to the person talking to you the state of the world. Look at how inequality has grown within countries and between countries, and not only in the global south, in the very same global north. And what this produced as right-wing populist movements in the very same global north before the global south. And how this is eating at the so-called individual freedoms and liberties in the very same countries. Look at how the movements that were vanquished in 1945 are now the movements that are growing in the entire world and threatening peace and in the entire world. Who is growing? Look at the map. If international peace and security is very seriously broken, I doubt it will be because of any conflict in the global south. It will be because of conflict in the global north. So, and the seeds of the conflicts in the global north are being sown. So, and this, to a great extent, can be linked to the neoliberal, because the so-called welfare state policies of post-1945 were meant to keep social peace and were meant to prevent violence within societies and between societies. Now we have violence everywhere. And violence, by the way, is not only shooting. Poverty is violence. Deprivation is violence. So you can mention this. Maybe you can convince this person.
Please.
So, first of all, just a point. There is an elephant in the room here because I think I'm loud enough. Okay. There's an elephant in the room here because we are trying to make a connection between neoliberalism and militarization or humanitarian militarization. But capitalism has always been relying on militarization from the beginning. What is the category of neoliberalism doing that the category of capitalism was not doing before? And I know I am speaking against my own professional interests here, but it is just something to think about. What is specific about the era that we're living in that is different from the last 500 years or so? So this is the first thing. The second thing is, there's a point that Jason made about international law. There is no court and there's no tribunal through which that argument can work. I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit harsh. There is nothing more Eurocentric than the idea that law is only produced in a court.
But they had Brexit, so
I'm sorry. He's Scottish, though.
Well, they have to go with the English.
Yeah. Again, there is something terribly Eurocentric about this statement. When you have the biggest protests around the world saying that what we're facing is a genocide, this to me could easily be the international law being done in a different way. And therefore, the same thing could be said about humanitarianism, is that when you have movements, organizations, campaigners, volunteers all around the world collecting aid and fighting to pass it on into Gaza through the Rafah border, this still counts as humanitarianism. And therefore, we need to ask whether there are still mobilizational possibilities and movements that could dislodge or disentangle humanitarianism from neoliberal technology or international law from neoliberal technology, because I feel this is exactly what is happening right now. And I'm repeating again what Dr. Ibrahim Awad said. For the last, 30 years, civil society has been taking over what Arab states used to do. And therefore, for us up till now to still be talking about third world sovereignty as the answer, to me is too limited, because so much has happened since that third world moment that we cannot just ignore.
All right. I want to deal directly with the law point. And I acknowledge that my thinking is Eurocentric. I have absolutely no problem with that. So the problem with law is a really simple problem, which is that law doesn't exist. You can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it. It's not real. So law is whatever we define law to be. And if you want to define protest to be part of law, go ahead. I'm not going to argue with you. My definition of law is very stipulative and very simplistic. Law is the social application of violence. If you remove violence from the equation, you're not talking about law, you're talking about morality. The distinction between law and morality is that if you don't obey the law, someone hits you with a big fucking stick. Morality, on the other hand, God ticks a box, and you wait and see if you pick the right God or not. So what I am saying is that the thing that we call law, this nonsense body of rules and protests that no state gives a shit about, this thing is only meaningful when it's attached to socially centralized violence. And I'll put that in the firmest stance that I can. This is not quite an absolute statement, I'm going to qualify it. But what you are calling international law isn't law. There's only one form of international law, and that's the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, International Investment Arbitration, and the UN Security Council. And what those 5 institutions have in common is that they can access socially centralized violence to punish those who disobey. So those are the institutions that states obey. When Human Rights Watch has an army, I'll start taking them seriously. When the ICJ has a police force, I'll start taking them seriously. If you can point to any institution in international law that has jurisdiction and the ability to enforce it, then I'll acknowledge it's a legal institution. But none of them exist. Now, this isn't a problem. The problem is that we want law to be good, and law has never been good. If we give up on the idea that law is good, we give up on the idea that law could save us, then maybe we can actually do something with humanitarianism. Maybe we can actually do something with social movements, but there's no point in calling that something law.
Okay, so just very briefly, I think disregarding the connection between law and power and trying to equate the protest movements and trying to equate those who articulate a position about morality, perhaps legality in a way, with those who have the capacity to enforce law, those who have the capacity to discipline through law in some instances and not in others, is perhaps a limited reading of the power dynamic behind the legal mechanism. Yes, international courts are Eurocentric projects and Eurocentric creations, but they make a difference in how we relate to law. They make a difference in how Ukraine can bring a case against Russia for violation of the Genocide Convention, but it cannot be done here. One cannot disregard that there is a very crucial aspect about international law and how state-centric it is and how state-centric it continues to be. It might empower other actors. It might allow other actors to become a part of the conversation about international law, but it still empowers the state, and one needs to be cognizant of that. Having said that, I just want to say something. I agree with you that the protests that we're seeing and the movements that we're seeing are perhaps emancipatory. One example that I think is very significant in what we're witnessing now is the critique of the notion of proportionality. The critique of the notion of proportionality has been limited to legal circles, to experts for a very long time. It's limited to the classroom. Now we are seeing how people on a daily basis are engaged in a critique of law, not of the application of law, but law in and of itself, and that potentially has an emancipatory potential. I don't know what will come out of it. I don't know if it will actually materialize into an alternative interpretation of law, but what I know also is that from the history of the relationship between law and power is that power tends to permeate any articulation of law that we come up with. So that's on.
But wait.
No, not necessarily. And there's no such thing as a hapless victim as well. That is victimization in and of itself. So response is a response that includes power in and of it in a way. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what will come out of that, but there is hope in the emancipation, and how Palestine is emancipating us out of our fixation on law as a solution. On the other question, on the question of neoliberalism, I think the unique thing about neoliberalism and humanitarianism is the professionalization of the humanitarian project. And I think turning it into an objective reality, the use of language about how you have certain objectives that you need to meet, the professionalization of seeking grants, and that is potentially what is unique here. And the problem is that this professionalization depoliticizes the engagement with the issues at hand. Not only does it erode the state, it also erodes claims about injustice by the state. So in the case of Palestine, it suspends questions about the occupation. It turns into questions about minute issues of human rights here and there. And I think this is a project of the neoliberal project more than the other earlier capitalist iterations. Thank you.
Here. Now, let me just add what that humanitarian logic does, which is really different. Look, I mean, the elephant in the room is right. We've had hundreds of years of this capitalist world, generations dealing with it. It was a racial capitalism. It was a racial capitalism that had colonialism, exactly as Nasreen is saying, as an engine. What this humanitarian turn and the neoliberal reduction, the total retreat of forms of solidarity, the reduction of people who are under threat by capitalism to individuals bereft of all their social context does, is that now we have empire without colonialism and racism without race. And they've taken away our capacity to even name the damn game for what it is. That's new, different, and dangerous, and that's all.
No, I'm sorry to take the floor repeatedly. I think you raised very interesting points. For someone, I think I repeat myself, an amateur, I'm not international lawyer, but I like to think about international law. I think that international law exists, and I say this to the students, when it comes, for instance, international refugee law. To me, the 1951 Convention, for instance, the states wanted to protect themselves before protecting the refugees. So to say this is the limit of what we can do. So this is the reality of, but by the way, even in domestic law, and the domestic law is also made by the most powerful. Your point about the demonstrators in the streets, it's very interesting. In fact, you're going the furthest here from realist perspectives in international relations. For you, it's not the state at all, it's humans who, unfortunately, these masses are not sitting in the Security Council, are not negotiating. However, the moment that they can organize in a sufficient way to exercise pressure on their states so that their states make policies differently, produce laws differently, at that moment maybe we can advance. But to which extent this can happen and where exactly, and look at where demonstrations are held. In some countries, territories, horizons, they are not held at all because of the relationship between these potential demonstrators and the states. So, and the question of power under neoliberalism is extremely important because power is a means to enforce neoliberalism, and maybe it could be also what undermines neoliberalism.
Thank you all very, very much. I enjoyed this very much, really. Thanks a lot for the audience. Yeah, exactly. Those who, yes, were so committed to the question concerning neoliberalism, to the extent that they remained. Yes, thank you all.